everybody. My name's Kate Jenkins and I'm Vice Chair at the LSE and I'm also a member of the Government Department. Could I start by welcoming you all very warmly to what we certainly in the Government Department regard as a very special evening. We're delighted to have Shirley Williams with us here this evening, and some of us are absolutely fascinated by the answer to the question she's posed us this evening. I think we will learn a very great deal. This year, as many of you know, is particularly interesting for us at the LSE because we have taken over the operation of the Women's Library, which is a major addition to our archives and our library in the school, and we're absolutely delighted that we've been allowed to take this over and continue its existence for many years into the future. So this is also the first evening on which British Government, which is the programme which is behind this particular lecture, and the Women's Library are jointly sponsoring this particular event. Very exciting for us, because many of you will realise that much of the Women's Library material is of immense significance to the study of politics and government in Britain in the last 200 years. So I think we are all going to benefit enormously from this new synergy. We have Shirley Williams here this evening, and she said to us, "Do women make good political leaders?" I think some of us might answer that fairly rapidly, but it's going to be very interesting to hear what she has to say. She is one of the most distinguished British politicians of her generation, and for many of us an icon of political determination, keeping going through all the ups and downs of political life. She certainly has been for my life, because I can remember first seeing her and speaking as chairman of the Fabian Society too long ago for either of us to remember, but was nevertheless a very memorable occasion for me. She was a member of the Labour Party and a Labour MP from 1964 to 83, and she's written memorably about the difficult time she went through in deciding to leave the Labour Party and join with 3 other senior members of the party in setting up the Social Democrat Party in the early 1980s. For that party, she was president for a number of years, and I think it was a very interesting example of the way in which really intensive and careful leadership can produce a remarkable change. It was all too short for many of us, but it was a very significant effort and episode in British political life in the 1980s. Before that, she had been a cabinet minister in the Labour government in the 1970s, and there again our paths crossed when she was the minister most involved in the difficult issue of introducing maternity leave and pay in the early 1970s, when it was not a popular or a politically acceptable subject to have. And we had to batter through a great deal of opposition to get what was then a very early maternity leave and pay legislation for women in this country, which I'm glad to say, in slightly different shape and form, has remained in place ever since. She was Secretary then for Prices and Consumer Protection, and also Secretary of State for Education, and very much involved in the introduction of the comprehensive education system. In 1988, she moved to Harvard and began effectively a new academic career. She was Professor of Public Service at Harvard at the Kennedy School, and for 2 years was also Director of the Institute of Politics. She stayed in Harvard until the end of the 90s, I think, 96, sorry, and returned to London, where she has been an extremely active member of the House of Lords. She was leader of the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords between 2001 and 2004, and has remained extremely active. I met her last year when she was apparently not having any sleep at all, dealing with the NHS bill, which I think received very major changes as a result of the pressure that was put on the government at that time. We now, I think, turn Shirley, looking forward very much to what you have to say to us this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Principal. May I begin by saying thanks to Kate James, because something she said, which I didn't know, has given me a very great deal of pleasure. And this is that, in fact, the taking over of the Women's Library, which is indeed a remarkable archive, which has been like an orphan wandering from one college or university to another in a desperate attempt to find a permanent home, and yet it is an archive of extraordinary value, one of the rarest in the history of the women's movement, because there are very few such archives. And to hear that it's ended up in the LSE gives me a great deal of pleasure, because the LSE is a very lively place. You can't sort of go to sleep here. You might get bitten, you might get stung, but the one thing you can't do is go to sleep. And that means that the Women's Library will now get, I think, the kind of attention it deserves, and the kind of argument and discussion that it's all about creating. Tonight what I'm going to talk about is quite broadly about the position of women in contemporary society, in our own society particularly, but not only in our own society, because I think we are now in a situation of a very, very interesting time, but a curious time. So let me begin by saying that I shall talk a bit about, begin by saying how strange it is that in all the countries of the world, let alone all the democracies, the United Kingdom now stands at 68th in the list of countries of the world in its proportion of women in Parliament. Now, the proportion of women in Parliament is only one of many, many tests, one of many, many measures, if you like. But for us to be 68th is pretty extraordinary by almost any measure. So one of the things I'm going to talk about a bit is why it is that the United Kingdom seems to be a country which is at one and the same time offering equal status to women, and yet somehow seems unable to deliver that in practice in terms of women therefore being roughly between a third and a quarter of the government system. The second thing I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to begin with it actually, is looking at my own life, which covered 2/3 of the 20th and 21st centuries so far, and looking at the way in which attitudes and styles of life have changed. And then finally, I want to talk a bit about the leadership of women, where it's actually happened. In our case, it's usually defined in terms of who is the head of government, or sometimes the head of state, and to see whether there's any significant difference between leadership by women and leadership by men, and if so, what is the relevance of that leadership to the challenges that now face our country, our continent, and the world. I promise you I shall give 10 minutes to each, so you won't be sitting here for hour after hour after hour. Well, let me begin then at the beginning. When I was born, which was in the 1930s, my mother told me that one of the things that was characteristic of her own parents was that if a boy was born to a family, the activity of the local Buxton Business Club, they lived in Buxton, Derbyshire, was to hand a cigar round to the company, which was entirely male, of congratulations at the birth of a boy. If a girl was born, they expressed commiserations and said, better luck next time, old boy. Now, that was a rather mild form of what, of course, is still characteristic of a very large part of our world, which is the celebration of the birth of a boy, and some horror, sometimes amounting to rejection, at the birth of a girl. And that can to some extent be associated with cultural activities. For example, let me take one example which I was discussing with a very prominent member of parliament from the Pakistani parliament at lunchtime today, and that is, of course, the devastating financial consequences of the dowry system. We hardly ever think about it. But when you think the birth of a girl in Pakistan or in other, particularly Asian and Middle Eastern countries, comes in effect with a price tag of what may be as much as the equivalent of 20 or 30,000 pounds, you can see how that ancient cultural artifact actually has much greater consequences than one might realise. Let me take another cultural factor which arises from this historic distinction that people make between boys and girls. I think I'm right in saying, it was certainly right 2 years ago, that in China there are now a surplus of 35 million men. That's 35 million men under the ages of 45. The reason for that, of course, was the one-child policy, which allowed people to move on to having a boy if they only had no birth accredited to them. And that, of course, in turn brought with it, in certain rural areas, a certain level of female infanticide. That's also true in India. There is a substantial surplus in rural parts of India of boys over girls, more than can be explained by the normal birth rate, which gives a very slight edge to boys for the straightforward reason that nature knows that fewer boys survive to the age of 5 than girls do. They're not as tough in the early years of their life. So what we're looking at, and I'll put that on one side, though it's something that's fascinating for you to discuss, is what do we think will happen to that very large surplus of young men? It could mean a warrior people, a warrior race. What at the moment it means is a certain amount of invasions, as it were, private invasions, into particularly countries like Laos and Cambodia, to try to find wives for Chinese young men who can't find any wives at home. We rarely read about that, but it's actually quite an important factor. And also, of course, another important factor is that girls from the most deprived parts of the world then become not dowry receivers, but for the first time economic assets, because they may be able to be sold or passed over to families that are able to pay for them in return for their being brides for their sons. It's quite a big, important social factor, and incidentally, for those of you who are pondering what to write for your PhD, it's almost unexplored territory, and one that's well worth looking at. But let me go back for the moment to Britain and ask ourselves about the set of attitudes and factors that indeed had a major effect on the future prosperity and lives of girls. The very first thing to say, and this lasted right up until the time when I was Education Secretary in the 1970s, was a very widespread belief that boys and girls had rather different brains. The phrase that was quite often used was hard subjects and soft subjects. Soft subjects were foreign languages, literature, history. Hard subjects were science, particularly physics, the exception of botany, which, being a soft subject, was one of the oddities of the whole attitude towards different disciplines. But the other important factor was that among the young women, the general belief was that therefore they should be directed towards foreign languages, English literature, history, what were known as soft subjects, doubtless the extreme irritation of a number of academics in this audience who would not accept such a description of their own discipline. Boys were thought to be appropriate for hard subjects, and they were essentially mathematics, and as I've already said, the sciences, particularly physics and chemistry.